Hey, sewing fam. It's no secret that I've got a ton of stuff everywhere, and I like to use baskets to keep it all contained. But I hate it when I have a bunch of mixed match baskets that don't go with anything in my house. It just doesn't match the decor. And I've solved that problem by making baskets that not only match my decor, but that I think are just absolutely beautiful. My name's Maddie, and I'm going to show you how to make your own basket in the size that you need that's going to make your space look beautiful. So let's talk about what you're going to need. So this basket is made from leather on the bottom with fabric for the lining and the very top of the basket here. So that means you're going to need leather, vinyl, or you can actually use fabric for the leather parts if you already have stuff in your stash that you want to use. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with working with leather, there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind when it comes to the actual temper of the leather. So looking at this basket, the purple leather that I used for this was actually a pretty stiff 3-ounce leather. And I'll tell you what, if I were trying to sew this on my domestic machine, I would have had big time problems. Bulky seams and stiff leather really kind of make your machine work extra hard. Now, in comparison, this leather here was a medium firmness, but it's stiff enough. It has enough body to be able to hold its own shape really well, especially when things are inside it. So you don't need to treat it with anything else to stiffen it up. And when you're looking at the actual hide, this is what it looks like. So you can see this is a 3 to 4 ounce leather, and it's got some pretty good body. I mean, the drape on that is just not very drapey. When you compare it to this leather, you can see that this leather has a whole lot more drape. You see how it just folds? This is a much softer leather. Any of these leathers are fine, but this silvery purple one that I'm going to use today is actually going to need something to help make it keep its oomph, right? And to give it that extra structure that we need, we're going to be using fusible foam. Now this is a flex foam. It's two-sided fusible. If you can find one-sided, even better. This is what I've got, so this is what I'm gonna use. And if you're going to make your baskets using just fabric, you're definitely going to want to back it with this. And then, of course, you can always use vinyl. Vinyl is on the thinner side. I mean, you can find leathers that are this thin as well. But of course, this is going to need that extra structure. So you're going to want to use that fusible foam on vinyl as well. So you already know that we need leather, vinyl, fabric, whatever combination of those you'd like. You're also going to need a really long ruler or even a yardstick so that way we can get some of these longer pieces drawn on our fabric and leather, some wonder clips, and if you have it, some double-sided tape. This is optional, but it comes in really handy. So that's what you need. Let's talk about the dimensions. Let's head on over to the cutting table. First, let's take a look at this basket. So I wanted to use the rule of thirds for this basket, which means that this bottom part here is 2/3 and this is 1/3 of the overall length. And because I wanted to make the measurements easy on myself, I decided that I was going to make the overall wall of this 6 inches long. So that means that this bottom piece is 4 inches, this top piece is 2 inches. And then for the bottom of my basket, this is 10 by 10. Now, for those of you who like math and want to play around with different dimensions, let's talk about it. So we have the bottom base is 10 by 10, right? But we need to add seam allowances to that. Now, I like using 3/8 seam allowances because it makes attaching the lining really easy. So we're going to use 3/8. And when you double 3/8 seam allowances, that equals 3/4. So we need our base squares to be 10 3/4 long. If you have enough materials, you can cut this entire piece, both of these actually, in one long strip. If not, you may have to split it in half, but if we're doing one long strip, we know that it's got to be all sides of our 10-inch square, right? Plus seam allowance. So our bottom strip needs to be 40 inches, and then we wanted it to be 4 inches wide. So when you add seam allowance to both of those, it ends up being 40 3/4 by 4 3/4. And when you do that to the top strip, it's going to be the same exact length that we used for that bottom one. So it's going to be 40 by 2 inches, which makes it 40 3/4 by 2 3/4. So these are the dimensions that we need to cut out of our leather. We've got the 10 3/4 by 10 3/4 square. And then we've got this bottom strip, which is 40 3/4 by 4 3/4, right there. This handle right here is 4 3/4 by 1 3/4. Oh my gosh! Did I tell you to make the handles 1 3/4? That's only if you're using fabric, because you have to sew the seam allowances and turn it in. If not, cut it to 1 by 4, because look, I forgot to cut it down and it's entirely too wide. So you definitely want it to be 1 inch wide by 4 inches long if you're using vinyl or leather. Don't make my mistake. And you're gonna need 4 of those. So all of these pieces are what you're going to need to cut out of your leather. Now let's talk about the fabric. We already know for this top piece, we need 4 3/4 by 2 3/4. Now we need to look at the inside lining. Now this is gonna be pretty simple. The base is gonna be the same as the leather. So we've already determined that that's 10 3/4 by 10 3/4. And then we're going to cut this wall all in one piece. There's no need for us to have to sew that together. And because that is 6 inches wide, we're going to cut that to 40 3/4 by 6 3/4. So out of your fabric, you're going to need to cut that outside top strip, a bottom square for the inside of your basket, and then the inside wall lining part of your basket, which is 40 3/4 by 6 3/4. Now let's talk about the foam. Depending on your material, you may not need foam for all of the pieces, but we're going to attach it to the outside pieces of our basket. For this one, because it's a medium tempered leather and it holds its shape, I did not need to put any foam on the leather part of this. However, for the new basket, I'm going to be using this more drapey, softer leather, and it definitely needs the reinforcement. So I'm going to cut foam strips for the bottom here and for the top piece only. And we're going to cut those foam pieces so that way they don't get caught in our seam allowance. So we need a 40 by 4 inch strip of foam, and then we also need that top strip, which is 40 by 2 inches. That's what we're going to do. So here's my leather, and here's my foam piece, and I am just going to fuse it right onto my leather this way, right in the middle there. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing with my fabric. So those are all of the pieces that you need. Now let's go ahead and just round off the corners of our square pieces. So grab something that has a rounded edge. I'm going to use this little bowl here, and I'm just going to put it right up on the edge here and mark that out like that. Go ahead and cut that one corner off. There, we've got a nice rounded edge. Now fold it in half and use that cut as your guide for the other side. Okay, now we have the two sides. Fold that in half again. and repeat. Okay, so now that we have those beautiful rounded edges, grab your fabric and we're going to do the same thing on this. Line up your leather piece and cut off those corners. So now that this is prepped, let's take our foam and these pieces on over to the iron so that way we can fuse our foam right on there. Okay, so I have my leather down right side against my ironing board. I actually cut my strips in half. It's not ideal, but it works. Position it down in the middle, and I'm going to use a piece of scrap fabric as a pressing cloth since mine is fusible on both sides, so I'll just have to peel it off of here. So this is now done and it's totally fused. Now we're going to do it to our top fabric strip. Okay, and now that I have the bottom, now that it's fused on there, I'm going to turn it over and hit this fabric on the top with my iron again. Back to the cutting table. So now that we have our foam on both sides, we're going to attach these two. We're going to sew them together. So go ahead and line up that bottom with the bottom piece. We're going to clip it together along this seam. Now we're going to sew this at a 3/8 seam allowance. A couple of things to note before we start sewing this is that you're definitely not going to want to use cotton thread. There's something about the chemical reaction between leather and cotton that will make the thread rot quickly. So definitely use a synthetic thread. Also, I have a leather needle in my machine. Now, while it's not absolutely necessary if you're using like a softer leather, if you're using something that is on the stiffer side, you're definitely going to want that leather needle. However, a heavy duty or denim needle should work just fine. Also, make sure that you lengthen your stitch a bit. I lengthened mine to 4.0. So now when you fold up that top edge here, this is what the outside of our basket's going to look like. On the back side, however, we're going to want the seam allowance facing up, because we're going to top stitch over that. So make sure that it's up. Put it back under your machine, and we're going to top stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you lengthen your stitch here again. Now I like to lengthen mine all the way up to a 6. 5 or 6 should work fine and look really beautiful. So at this point, if you're planning on sewing on your handle, we're going to have to deal with that at this point. But if you plan on just riveting it on like I did here, you can skip this step for now. I'm going to sew my handles onto this basket, but first I need to find the middle point and make little snips at the center point. And we're going to put that aside. Now grab the handle pieces that you've cut out. If you're making your handles out of fabric, you're going to want to put them right sides facing each other, and then you are going to sew around a 3/8 seam allowance, leaving a hole so that you can flip it and then iron it flat. If you're working with leather or vinyl, you don't need to do that. So I have 2 that are cut to the same length, and we're going to put them together with wrong sides facing each other. And I'm just going to stick this down with some double-sided tape. Okay, now grab your pieces, line them up carefully. Like that, and then we're going to top stitch around the edge here, at a 1/8 seam allowance. So now come back here and you see where we have that little middle snip. We're just going to fold our handle just a bit so we can find out where that middle point is, and we're going to position it right along that 1/4 inch stop, that 1/4 inch stitching right there at the bottom. So go ahead and add your double stick tape right here. Okay, there's that center point. There's that notch. And I'm going to line it right here on the bottom. So at this point you can either sew along your top stitching, going back and forth, or you can sew a little box, which is what I'm going to do on this one. When you're done, this is what it looks like. So now we need to fold this back in half. Make sure that you're matching up these seams perfectly on the side here. There we go. At the bottom. And we're going to sew that at a 3/8 seam allowance. Okay, so now that that's sewn, we need to do some top stitching on the other side. So flip it right side out. Flip your seam allowance to one side. It really doesn't matter which. And then we're going to top stitch that at a 1/4 inch. Okay, so I have it top stitched now. At this point, we want to position our next handle down over here the same way we did with the last one, using our tape. And when it's all sewn on, this is what it looks like on both sides. So now at this point, what we need to do is match up our center points here, and we need to add some additional clips in on the sides. And this will come in handy for the next step. Now we're going to attach this base here. So let's also add those midway points onto this piece. You can either do slits, or you can cut out a teeny tiny little triangle at the end here, like that. It makes it a little easier to see. See? There we go. Now flip this so that it is wrong side out. And we're going to put right sides facing each other, matching up all of those center points. So now that I have all the 1/4 points pinned, I'm going to come down here and take it all the way to the where that curve begins. I can see it on this side too. And then right here, you can see that my material buckles just a little bit. I'm going to put a couple slits in here, just so that that can lay flat, like that. And I'm going to do that on all sides. So now that the bottom is sewn on, this is what it looks like. And then the inside is going to look like this. And you can really see the basket coming together now. So what we're going to do now is, in each of these little rounded edges, we need to snip out little triangles because we want these corners, when they get flipped right side out, to look nice and flat. So when you're done with that, we're going to put this aside and we're going to grab our lining pieces now. So you need the bottom square and that inside wall piece. And we're going to put together our lining the same way that we did this. So go ahead and sew your lining into a tube and attach it to the base here. And so here's my lining all sewn up. Now I'm going to bring over the other part that we had made, and I'm going to take my lining and match up the notches along the side here and pin my seam allowances together, because we're going to sew these flat edges down and connect the lining to the bottom here. So that way we don't have lining that's kind of flopping around inside of our basket. Now that we're all pinned, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to attach them right here, sewing at about a 1/4 inch, making sure that I don't cross the stitching that's already there. Okay, so now it's all attached. Now what we are going to do is come in here and trim our seam allowances down so that it's close to the stitching, but not crossing that stitching, right? We don't want to cut through the stitches, but we do want to get this as small as possible so that way it's not sticking out when we flip our baskets to the other side. So just very carefully cut your seam allowances as small as you comfortably can, like that. After you have it all trimmed down, let's go ahead and flip the basket to the right side out, making sure that our rounded corners look nice. And now we're going to grab our lining from the inside and we're going to pull it up and just pin it temporarily around all of the edges, just to make it a little easier to work with. Okay, so now what we're going to do is fold the edges in and match them up. Now I like to pull my lining up a little higher to make it a little tighter on the inside. There we go. And you're going to want to do this all the way around. And use as many clips or pins as you need to get this edge looking nice. So this is what my basket looks like all pinned up. I use a lot of clips. So I'm going to go ahead and take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch close to that edge. And just like that, you have your own beautiful basket that matches your decor. So much fun. Now let's talk about some variations that you might actually want to do. Maybe you want to make a bigger basket like this one that's 9 inches tall overall. And really all it calls for is 6 3/4 width for this one and 3 3/4 for this top part. Or here's another really fun idea. Maybe you take a strip of the vinyl or leather that you made that's about 3/4 wide and you top stitch it on over that edge there for a beautiful finish. I mean, the options here are limitless, so have fun with them. And if you do make them, make sure that you tag me over on Instagram at Marisos for Curves, so that way I can see your beautiful creation. Well, go ahead and add your handmade gifts to your baskets. And in case you missed the slipper boot tutorial that I did using a free pattern, make sure that you check out this video right over here. And you all, in case no one's told you, please remember that I love you, and I hope that you have an amazing day.